In 1999, a National Geographic photographer named Dan Buettner was given one assignment: find the places on Earth where people live longest and figure out why. He spent the next decade doing exactly that. What he found was not a drug, not a treatment protocol, not a diet invented by anyone in the last century. It was something far stranger and far more difficult to package into a product. It was a way of living, a set of habits so ordinary that the people practicing them had never once thought of them as health habits at all. And what those habits do to the human body, what the research found when it looked underneath the observation, is what this video is about. There's a mountain village in Sardinia called Villa Grande Strisciali. It sits at about 700 meters above sea level, surrounded by terrain that has never been particularly forgiving: rocky slopes, seasonal heat, isolation from the coast. The men who grew up there spent their lives walking that terrain. Shepherds covering 5 to 10 miles of elevation change daily. Farmers tending crops on land that didn't yield easily. Artisans who worked with their hands for 6, 7 decades without stopping. By the time Dan Buettner and his team of demographers arrived there in the early 2000s, they found something that the actuarial data had suggested, but that seeing in person was genuinely startling. The ratio of centenarians to the general population was 10 times higher than in the United States. Not slightly higher, 10 times. And the pattern tilted male. Unusual, because in virtually every other part of the world, women consistently outlive men by a meaningful margin. In Sardinia's Blue Zone, the ratio was nearly equal. The team spent months documenting what life looked like there. What they found was not a secret diet or an herbal remedy. It was structure, the physical and social structure of a life built around constant, low-grade activity and deep human connection. These men didn't exercise. They worked. They didn't schedule social time. They had family dinners that lasted hours, every day, as a matter of course. They drank a glass or two of the local Cananao wine, a variety unusually high in flavonoids and polyphenols, not as a health strategy, but as a ritual that had accompanied every shared meal for as long as anyone could remember. Here's what was interesting. And this is the part most coverage of Blue Zone skips entirely. When researchers looked at the Sardinian men who reached 100 versus those who didn't, the diet wasn't the primary distinguishing factor. The men who reached 100 and the men who died in their 80s ate roughly the same things. What separated them statistically was the degree of continued physical engagement with their environment. Specifically, whether they kept moving through demanding terrain into their 80s and beyond. The shepherds, who had no choice but to keep walking because that was the work, tended to outlive the men who had retired from physical labor. Not because walking is magic, because the body, deprived of the demand to function at a meaningful physical level, begins to accommodate that lower demand. And the accommodation is visible in the data as accelerated decline. This is a different story than the one most longevity content tells. It isn't about finding the right food or the right supplement. It's about understanding what happens to a human body when it spends decades under consistent, moderate physical demand versus what happens when that demand disappears. The Sardinian shepherds weren't living long because they had figured something out. They were living long because their circumstances had never stopped requiring the thing the research would later confirm was critical. What the body does when it keeps being asked to function is not the same as what the body does when it is finally left alone Think of muscle tissue the way you'd think of a language you learned as a child. If you use it every day, it stays sharp, available, responsive. If you stop using it, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually over years, it begins to fade in ways you don't fully notice until you try to find a word that used to come instantly and realize it no longer does. The analogy isn't casual. Muscle tissue, like language, has a use it or lose it architecture. And in adults over 50, the rate at which it's lost when not actively maintained is one of the most consistent and clinically significant findings in aging research. Here's the specific number that matters. Researchers studying the relationship between grip strength and mortality, grip strength being the most widely used proxy measurement for whole body muscle health, have found across multiple independent studies and a meta-analysis covering more than 3 million participants that every 5-kilogram reduction in grip strength is associated with a 16% increase in risk of death from any cause. Not a trend, not a suggestion. 16% per 5 kilograms, independent of age at measurement, independent of pre-existing illness, independent of whether the participant smoked or had other cardiovascular risk factors. Grip strength doesn't measure your hand. It measures what your hand reflects, the functional muscle mass your entire body is maintaining across decades of daily demand or daily inactivity. Peter Attia, a physician who has spent much of his career studying the physiology of aging, describes muscle mass as one of the most underappreciated biomarkers in preventive medicine. Not because having muscles is aesthetically valuable, but because skeletal muscle is metabolically active tissue doing critical work continuously, pulling glucose out of the bloodstream after meals, anchoring bone density, moderating inflammatory signaling across the body. When that tissue declines, those functions don't just diminish. They shift their burden elsewhere. To the pancreas managing blood sugar with less muscular uptake available. To the joints managing load without adequate muscular support. To the immune system managing baseline inflammation without the moderating effect of active skeletal muscle. The Sardinian shepherds weren't doing strength training. They were doing something the research would come to see as equivalent or better. Sustained, daily, functional movement across terrain that required real muscular effort without cessation across decades. There's a second mechanism the Blue Zone's research identified, one that operates through a completely different biological pathway, but produces outcomes the grip strength data can't capture. Elizabeth Blackburn, who received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2009 for her work on telomeres, has studied the relationship between lifestyle factors and telomere length, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with cell division, and are now understood as one of the biological markers of aging at the cellular level. What her research and subsequent work in her field has found is that chronic stress, social isolation, and sedentary behavior are all independently associated with accelerated telomere shortening. Whereas regular moderate physical activity, strong social connection, and what researchers have called a sense of purpose are associated with longer telomere maintenance across aging populations. This is the biological architecture underneath what Buettner observed in Sardinia, Okinawa, and Ikaria. Communities where the cellular biology of aging was being modified, not by design, but by the consistent presence of conditions the body interprets as reasons to maintain itself. Here's the question worth sitting with before going further. If the habits that produce these outcomes are as ordinary as walking demanding terrain, sharing long meals, and having relationships that don't disappear with retirement, why aren't more people experiencing them? The answer isn't that people aren't trying. It's that the structure of modern life systematically removes the conditions under which these habits occurred naturally in blue zone populations, without replacing them with anything that functions equivalently. Take movement. The Sardinian shepherd didn't decide each morning to go for a walk. He went because the sheep needed water, and the water was downhill, and the grazing land was uphill, and there was no option but to cover that ground on foot. The physical demand was embedded in the structure of the day. It couldn't be skipped. It couldn't be scheduled for a more convenient time. It happened because the life required it. Retirement, in particular, does something to this structure that the longevity research has documented with uncomfortable consistency. A study following more than 300,000 people across 15 European countries, published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, found that the risk of clinical depression increased by 40% in the years immediately following retirement. Not because people don't want to retire, because retirement, as it's typically structured, removes not just the job, but the daily movement, the routine social contact, and the sense of purpose that the job was inadvertently providing. All three of those things are associated with better long-term health outcomes. All three tend to diminish together. This is the antagonist that the longevity research keeps finding underneath the inspiring stories. Not a disease, not a pathogen, not a nutrient deficiency. It's the gradual disappearance of structure, the disappearance of circumstances that were providing health benefits without anyone having to choose them. Now consider the social connection data, because it reveals the same pattern from a different angle. Psychologist Julianne Holt-Lunstad at Brigham Young University conducted a meta-analysis published in PLOS Medicine, examining data from 148 independent studies covering more than 300,000 participants. The finding: people with strong social relationships had a 50% higher likelihood of survival over a given follow-up period compared to those with weaker social ties. 50% higher likelihood of survival. In a follow-up analysis, Holt-Lundstad's team found that the mortality risk associated with social isolation and loneliness was comparable in size to the risk associated with smoking 15 cigarettes a day and exceeded the risk associated with clinical obesity. On Ikaria, the Greek island where researchers found exceptionally low rates of dementia and cardiovascular disease, the residents didn't have social lives in the way modern people schedule them. A weekly coffee, a monthly dinner, a quarterly gathering. They had an interwoven daily fabric. Neighbors who stopped by without calling, communal festivals that lasted days, extended family networks that involved multiple generations under the same roof or within walking distance of it. The social contact wasn't a chosen activity supplementing a largely solitary life. It was the texture of the life itself. What the data is revealing is that the habits associated with longest healthy lifespan in every blue zone studied are, at their core, habits that modern life has architecturally removed, and that most people attempting to replicate them are trying to insert them deliberately into a structure that was specifically designed around their absence. So what does someone who doesn't live on a mountainside in Sardinia actually do with this? Picture Eleanor. She's 67, retired 3 years ago from a career in nursing. She'd been active throughout her working life. Not by choice, but by circumstance. Hospital floors don't offer sitting options. Patients don't come to you. She covered 4 to 6 miles a day without tracking a single step. She talked to colleagues all day without thinking of it as social time. She had a purpose that showed up for her every morning, whether she'd arranged it or not. After retirement, those things didn't just diminish, they disappeared. The fatigue she expected to feel from decades of physical work transformed into a different, quieter kind of fatigue. The kind that comes from too much stillness, too many days with no particular reason to be anywhere. She knew, intellectually, that she should exercise more. She found she couldn't quite summon the motivation. She knew she should see friends more. She found the scheduling exhausting in a way the nursing shifts never were. What Eleanor had lost wasn't time or health or even energy. She'd lost structure. The structure that had been delivering movement, purpose, and connection automatically every working day for 35 years. The Blue Zone's research offers something useful for people in Eleanor's situation because the populations that thrived longest weren't people who had unlimited time and motivation to build healthy habits. They were people whose circumstances had arranged those habits for them, which means the most actionable translation isn't add a habit, but restructure a circumstance. For movement, this means finding functional demand, not a gym routine that depends on daily motivation, but activities whose completion requires physical effort that can't be easily skipped. Gardening, dog ownership, living with someone whose daily rhythm requires going outside. The specific activity matters far less than whether it's embedded in something that happens, regardless of how motivated you feel on a given Tuesday. For social connection, the Holt-Lundstad data is specific. It wasn't the size of the social network that produced the survival advantage. It was the quality and frequency of the actual contact. One close relationship maintained through weekly, genuine engagement appears to offer more protective effect than a wide network of occasional contact. A weekly walk with the same person. A standing phone call that neither party cancels. A class or group whose schedule creates a recurring social appointment that doesn't require redeciding each time. For purpose, the Okinawan concept of ikigai, a reason to wake up each morning, appears in the research as something associated with meaningfully lower rates of cognitive decline and physical disability in later life. The research doesn't specify what the purpose should be. It specifies that it should feel meaningful to the person experiencing it, that it should involve engagement with others, and that it should provide a structure that makes the next day feel like something to show up for. None of these require a complete life overhaul. They require asking a different question. Not, how do I add a healthy habit to the life I already have? But, how do I restructure my life so that the habits the research supports are required, rather than optional? Eleanor eventually found her answer in a volunteer role at the same hospital she'd left. Not full-time, 2 days a week. Enough to restore the structure, enough to bring back the movement, the contact, and the reason. Here is where the longevity research becomes something more than a collection of interesting findings. In Loma Linda, California, the only blue zone in North America, a community of Seventh-day Adventists has been studied continuously since the 1950s. The Adventist Health Studies, spanning more than 100,000 participants over decades, represents some of the longest-running and most carefully controlled observational research in nutrition and lifestyle science. What the researchers found wasn't one thing that made Adventists live longer than surrounding Californians by an average of 7 to 10 years. It was the interaction of several things happening simultaneously. They ate largely plant-based diets. But so did many communities that didn't show the same longevity advantage. They were physically active, but so were many comparison populations without equivalent outcomes. What the Adventist data kept surfacing was a compounding effect. The same people who ate well also slept more consistently, maintained stronger social ties through religious community, had a clear weekly structure of rest and reflection, and reported higher levels of what researchers measured as sense of purpose. When researchers tried to isolate any single factor, the effect size was meaningful but modest. When they looked at populations where multiple factors were present simultaneously, the effect size grew in a way that wasn't simply additive. Movement plus connection plus purpose plus sleep created something greater than the sum of its parts, a pattern of living that the biology appeared to treat as a sustained signal to maintain itself, rather than to begin the gradual accommodation of decline. Elizabeth Blackburn's telomere research helps explain why. Telomeres don't just shorten continuously over time. Their rate of shortening is modifiable by the physiological environment surrounding them. Chronic stress accelerates shortening. Regular moderate physical activity slows it. Strong social connection is associated with longer maintenance. And all three together appear to interact. The person who moves, connects, and sleeps well shows telomere maintenance that the person doing any one of those things alone typically doesn't reach. What Buettner's team ultimately concluded, after years of fieldwork across 5 continents, was that the Power 9, the 9 shared habits of blue zone populations, weren't 9 separate interventions. They were one integrated way of living that happened to produce 9 measurable outputs. The Sardinian shepherd wasn't separately deciding to exercise, then separately deciding to connect with community, then separately pursuing purpose. The shepherd's life was one thing. The movement, the relationships, and the meaning were all the same life, inseparable. This is the part of the longevity story that gets lost when people try to implement it piecemeal. You can take the Okinawan diet without the ikigai. You can take the movement without the community. You can take the plant-based eating without the structure of regular rest. And you'll get some benefit from each because each factor has independent value in the research. But the outcomes that appear at the population level in these communities, the 7 to 10 additional years, the dramatically lower rates of dementia, the functional mobility and cognitive clarity into the 90s, those outcomes are the product of the whole, not the parts. The question the data leaves you with is not, which blue zone habit should I add? It's what in my life right now is creating the conditions under which these habits become possible, and what is preventing them. There's a moment in Buettner's original National Geographic article from 2005, the piece that introduced the phrase blue zone to the world, where he describes sitting down to eat with a group of elderly Sardinian men in a small village. He notes that the meal lasted 3 hours, that everyone at the table was over 80, that the conversation moved between family, local history, and gentle argument about whose grandfather had lived longest. He wasn't describing a longevity protocol. He was describing an ordinary Saturday afternoon for people who happen to have some of the longest healthy lifespans ever recorded. What's worth thinking about is what that scene contains that most Saturday afternoons in modern life don't. Physical ease. These men could walk and sit and gesture without obvious strain well into their 80s and beyond. Sustained social engagement, not a scheduled activity, but the natural continuation of relationships that had been running for 60 or 70 years. Shared narrative. A sense of history that extended beyond any individual and continued forward. Time that wasn't being optimized for anything except the pleasure of being in it. The research that has accumulated since 2005 hasn't complicated that picture. It has deepened it. The grip strength data added a biological marker, to what Buettner observed in how these men moved. The Holt-Lundstad meta-analysis added a mortality figure to what he observed in how they related. Blackburn's telomere research added a cellular mechanism to what he observed in how they aged. The people who find this channel are usually people who have started asking a different kind of question about their health. Not, how do I treat what's wrong, but how do I understand what produces what's right? That's the distinction this channel is built around. If this is the kind of conversation that makes you want to understand more, not just about longevity, but about the actual science underneath the habits and places and populations that appear in the headlines, follow along. This is a channel for people who want the research explained at this level, not summarized into a tip list, but unpacked carefully enough to actually change how you think. There's one more layer to what this video has been building toward. Because everything explored so far, the movement, the connection, the compound effect, describes what happens in lives where these things are structurally present. What the final block addresses is something the research doesn't usually say plainly. Not just what produces long and healthy life, but what these habits are actually protecting and why it matters beyond the years themselves. Go back to the village in Sardinia. The shepherds climbing the same hillsides their grandfathers climbed. The 3-hour Saturday meal. The men in their 90s not talking about their health, not tracking their steps, not taking inventory of their supplements, just present, in the life they had always lived, surrounded by the people who'd always been in it. What they had wasn't a longevity strategy. They had continuity. A life that had never fundamentally interrupted the conditions under which the human body, over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, learned to maintain itself. The research that has come since, the grip strength studies, the telomere data, the social connection meta-analyses, hasn't revealed that those men were doing something clever. It has revealed that they were doing something old, something the biology of a human body already knows how to respond to, because the biology was shaped over eons by exactly those conditions. Sustained physical demand, deep social embedding, and the daily presence of something worth doing. Modern life isn't hostile to all of this, but it does remove it by default. It creates conditions where physical demand has to be chosen rather than encountered, where social contact has to be scheduled rather than inhabited, where purpose has to be invented rather than inherited. None of those things are impossible. They're just not automatic. And the gap between automatic and deliberate turns out to matter enormously, because most people manage to do things deliberately for a while and then stop, and then start again, and then stop. And the cumulative effect of that inconsistency is not the same as the cumulative effect of conditions that never required a decision. Here's what the longevity research is actually saying. Underneath all the specific findings, the body doesn't need to be convinced to live long. It needs to be given a reason. Consistent physical demand is a reason. Deep human connection is a reason. A daily purpose that draws you forward is a reason. Given those things, not occasionally, but as the structure of the day, the biology responds accordingly. The telomeres shorten more slowly. The muscle mass maintains longer. The markers of inflammation stay lower. The brain, kept engaged by relationship and purpose, retains more of its function further into life. The question worth carrying from this video isn't about diet or supplements or protocols. It's simpler than that, and harder. What in your life right now is giving your body a reason to maintain itself? And what has quietly disappeared Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually over the last several years. That used to be providing that reason without your ever having to notice it. If you want to keep thinking at this level, about aging not as inevitable decline, but as a biological response to conditions you have more influence over than you've been told, follow this channel. That's the conversation we're having here. Share this with someone in their 50s or 60s who still believes that getting older means gradually giving things up. The research suggests a different story is possible. And leave a comment with one thing from this video that changed how you see something you already do, or something you used to do that you've let go of. That's the conversation worth having. The years ahead are not fixed. They are being written right now by the conditions you're living in.